Lessons 1.21 and 1.22 are optional lessons, but that does not mean that they're not important. They're optional simply because I can't require you to enter into a relationship with a native speaker of this language that you're learning. And yet, that's really what language learning is all about, isn't it? It's about knowing people and being known by people. And therefore, lesson 1.21 prepares you for a Language Pals session. And lesson 1.22 is the content of the Language Pals session. Hopefully you found a correspondent with whom you can engage and who's trying to learn your language just as you're trying to learn theirs. And if not a correspondent on an international level, at least someone maybe locally who's a native speaker of the language that you're learning. And at the very least, if you have a classroom teacher whom you can interview and with whom you can interact in this language that you're learning. So in any case, let's dive directly into lesson 1.21 to get ready for this Language Pals session. Here we go. Okay, here you see we're in lesson 1.21, and the goal of 1.21 is to present you with the two different ways to form questions, thereby allowing you to be prepared to enter into the interview situation in lesson 1.22. So we go to the second section here, and you see that not all of these questions are going to be formed in two different fashions. There is basically one manner by which you know how to form the polite conversational expressions. And speaking of those polite conversational expressions, since you've just been working on them and to some extent have mastered them, why not throw in a couple additional ones here in addition to numbers 1 and 2. Numbers 1 and 2 ask you to find out what the person's name is and how old they are, but why not start off with a greeting, of course. And then once you've found out what their name is, indicate that you're pleased to meet them as well. So, of course, you could start off with bonjour or salut, if you know that expression. Salut is an informal way to say hello to a person. Salut. So bonjour, and then we come to the first question. And that first question, of course, is, now you may think it's comment t'appelles-tu? However, we're not making the assumption that this person is a peer, a person your age, a young person who is like you, a student in a classroom or maybe a homeschooled student, like I said, a roughly your age. You could be speaking to an adult for all I know, or you could be an adult speaking to an adult whom you don't know, and therefore it would be inappropriate to use tu at first, the familiar form. It would be appropriate to use vous in forming your questions. And if you go down through this lesson, you'll notice the image that I use here, the picture, is of the vous personal pronoun. And so all of these questions you're going to form using vous at first. However, and this is an important point, when you deal with a language which has a formal and a familiar way in which to say you, how do you know which is the appropriate one to use, and is it ever appropriate to change from vous to tu? Well, the answer is yes. There does come a point, an important point in fact, when it's important to make that transition from the formal to the familiar. And how will you know when that transition point happens? It'll happen because you start to establish a relationship with a person, and they see you more as, at least to some extent, as a friend, as opposed to a mere stranger or acquaintance that they're getting to know for the first time. Well, the key is you need to listen. You need to listen to the native speaker of the language. You, for the moment, are learning their language. Let them take the initiative of first using the familiar with you. So how will you recognize that? Well, of course, you'll hear the word tu. You hear the verb chopped. For example, look at number 3 there. The current form of that question is Est-ce que vous habitez aux États-Unis? Or the second form, Habitez-vous aux États-Unis? If the person says to you, and they won't say that right away most likely, but if it's a student and you're a young person, they could. If they say to you, Habites-tu aux États-Unis? Or Est-ce que tu habites aux États-Unis? It's very important that once they do that, I need to qualify that, but that you also make that transition to the familiar. If they use the familiar with you, but you use the formal with them, it kind of keeps them, you might say, at arm's length. As though you don't want to be too close, you don't want to be too friendly, and that's not a good thing. You want to follow their lead, so be listening carefully to when they use the familiar with you, because you need to make that transition into the familiar at that point too. But let the native speaker, in essence, invite you to do so. There actually is a verb for to use
It's called tutoyer. Est-ce qu'on se tutoie? Shall we tutoie each other? Which is, shall we use tu with each other? But they won't probably ask you that question. You wouldn't understand it if they did. So be listening to the tu used in their question. Now, I said I have to qualify that. Of course, if the person with whom you're speaking is an adult and you're a young person, if they speak to you in the familiar, that's normal. Especially if you're a very young person, say 10, 11, 12 years old, because they're not going to show a very young person undue respect in speaking the formal to them. So if they speak to you in the familiar and they're an adult, go ahead and keep using the formal with them. It would be kind of impertinent for you to use the familiar with an adult who's not a family member. Okay. Now, if they invite you to use tu in speaking with them, that's fine. How will you know if they invite you to do so? They'll probably repeat your question back to you using tu. They could say the expression I used, on se tutoie, shall we use tu with each other? But since you won't understand it, they'll have to probably repeat your question for you using tu, so that you'll know that they are suggesting you should use the familiar. Okay, but don't assume that's going to be the case if you're a young person speaking with an adult. Okay, so let's just look at a couple of these questions together, just give you a sense of what this lesson is all about. And I'd like to really come back again to the issue we just recently broached, which is the issue of pronunciation. This first question, of course, after you say bonjour, is therefore comment vous appelez-vous? Comment vous appelez-vous? If once you give them your name and they give you their name, it's natural that you would say enchanté, or oui, enchanté. I think it's the only expression I've taught you up to this point. So you would say enchanté. Don't stick your hand out. They can't reach you through the computer screen. Although in France, if you were meeting each other, you would absolutely shake hands. But just say enchanté. And if they happen to beat you to the punch, if they say it before you do, the response is pareillement. Likewise, pareillement. You can also just say enchanté as well back to them, but pareillement will impress them to no end. And the second question there is quel âge avez-vous? Quel âge avez-vous? Of course. And then let's move down to numbers 3 and 4, and I'll just give some examples or talk about the issue of pronunciation here in particular. Now, the first question, I think you can probably form these very easily without my help. Est-ce que vous habitez aux États-Unis? And habitez-vous aux États-Unis is the form of the second question. Okay. Now, this leads to an important point about which I spoke in the last class. The ULAT is constructed basically to replicate what's going on in your mind as you speak a language. In your mind, you have concepts or images related to what you want to communicate, want to convey, and it's not necessary here within the ULAT lesson, within the statements you're forming, the questions you're forming, to have a picture for every single word that you will say. For example, here you have the first question was Est-ce que vous habitez aux États-Unis? Est-ce que is really 3 words we could say, est, ce, and que, although there's a hyphen between the first two, but who cares? And then vous habitez aux États-Unis. We have 3 pictures. Although maybe if you want to consider the question mark itself, one of the pictures we could, I suppose. So we have 4 pictures and 8 words. Why is that the case? Well, it's because it's not necessary to give you a picture for every word to convey the general gist of what we're trying to, of what's should be going on in your mind as you want to express yourself. You have the first picture tells you it's a question. The second picture indicates to whom it's addressed. The third picture indicates what the action is you're asking about, and the fourth picture just provides enough supplementary information that you know how to complete your question. And so, for example, est-ce que vous habitez aux États-Unis? There's no picture corresponding to aux États-Unis. This is, and aux États-Unis would basically in English can correspond to the idea of in the United States. Through exposure and repetition, this word aux, and you don't even need to know how it's spelled. It's not spelled at all the way you think it is. You will become familiar with the use of this word, and you'll know that if you want to ask in the United States, it's simply always aux États-Unis. If you want to ask about in Canada, you say au Canada. etc. Okay, so you will not have a picture for every single word you need to say. Secondly, the issue of pronunciation. Now, I'm going to pronounce that same sentence as though in fact, I'm going to go down to number 4. And I'll pronounce that question. By the way, look at 4 for a second. What do you think it's asking? Okay, it's a question. I know that. We're talking to somebody with respect. It's about living. So it's about their abode, their home, their inhabitant, their habitation. So I guess in English it would be something like, do you live and have... I see 2 different options here. Apartment and house. Apartment, house and apartment. Probably it's asking one or the other. Okay, so you've got enough pictures there to certainly give you the sense of what you want to convey, right? All right. And so, est-ce que vous habitez... Now here comes one of those words for which there is no picture, but which you should have heard often enough that you'd be able to employ. Est-ce que vous habitez dans? Dans une maison, ou, and there's another word for which you have no corresponding picture, and you haven't had a lot of exposure to it yet. But as you see my hand, ou, this is the gesture I use to express an option. Ou, dans un appartement. Several things to mention here. First of all, let's talk about pronunciation. Est-ce que vous habitez dans une maison ou dans un appartement? Have you ever heard me speak like that up to this point? No, it's because, and this is the beauty of the Language Pals activity. If you're in a classroom with a classroom teacher who may not consider pronunciation to be that important, it's a secondary issue, a frill, you might say, that's unfortunate. That's really unfortunate, because that teacher is telling you that what you're learning is not, it's not a living language for a relationship with real people. It's just an academic subject you have to take in order to graduate. It's just an intellectual activity. Well, that's not what language is all about. And that teacher would be doing a grave disservice if they felt that pronunciation were not of critical importance. And that's, like I said, the beauty of the Language Pals activity is that you're entering into a relationship with a native speaker of your language. You do not want to be embarrassed as you speak to this person. You want them to respect you. And that requires, you're not going to pronounce perfectly at first, but they need to see that you're making an effort. You're trying to respect them and their language. Okay? So, let's go back now and try to think about the different elements of this question again, or the pronunciation of this question. Est-ce que, probably aren't too many ways to butcher that. Vous, now, here's where the first problem comes in. I talked about diphthongs in the course of our last class, how we can take a vowel sound, and in English, we extend it and we change the shape of our mouth and the position of our teeth and our tongue as we pronounce the word. Like I said, the word May, the month of May, A, okay? Or like in I mow the lawn, mow, oh, okay? In French, you don't do that. And so as you say habiter, habiter, once I start the sound E, nothing moves. I'm doing 2 things. I'm keeping the configuration of my mouth consistent. Nothing changes. And secondly, I'm chopping the vowel sound short. That will help me to avoid creating a diphthong, changing the shape of my mouth if I chop it short. Habiter, habiter, as opposed to, this is the atrocious thing you don't want to do, is habiter, habiter, a, okay? Habiter, habiter. Maybe you can't see it, but I can tell you, I can feel it. As you speak French, you will find that the muscles in this part of your face and in your jaw will be much more tense than they are in English. We tend to relax these muscles and say habiter, habiter, okay? In French, you'll tighten these muscles, and you cut the vowel sound short, and you keep the sound of each vowel sound pure. It's a, it's not a, it's I, not E, it's E, not A. Okay? Habiter, habiter. You want to be precise, you want the vowel sounds to be pure, and you want to chop them short. So, est-ce que vous habitez dans une maison? And again, we come to the sound U. U. I said you make the sound E. And by the way, I'm tightening these muscles right here to say E. I'm not saying E. I'm tightening these muscles. You almost could smile, I suppose, in order to tighten these muscles. E. E. Okay? E. I'm saying the sound I through the smallest possible opening in my lips. U, 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 une maison. And again, the sound I in maison. It's not maison, maison. It's maison. Chop the sound short. Don't let anything change. Okay? Maison. Ou dans un appartement. By the way, you're hearing what I call what are liaison, not what I call what are liaison. Connections between words that maybe you won't master at first. You won't anticipate. You'll say un appartement. And if you can say un appartement, I'm very proud of you. You're doing fine. Okay? But eventually you'll start to catch on to the fact that there are certain letters at the end of words that become pronounced when they're followed by a vowel sound. This will become evident once you see the word in written form. For the moment, just through imitation, you may pick up on some of these liaisons. But if you don't, it's not critical at this point. So let me continue. Un appartement. Un appartement. Est-ce que vous habitez dans une maison ou dans un appartement? Tighten the muscles in the face and you'll already be a long way toward improving your pronunciation. Now, the last issue within this question we need to address is the issue of the indefinite article. Why is it une maison but un appartement? It's une maison because we learned, as we learned the vocabulary in the first place, the word la maison, and as we review vocabulary in the lexicon, in case you aren't familiar with the lexicon, it's up here, take advantage of it. And you click on the picture of, for example, a house, you'll see me pronouncing it for you. You'll see me say maison. And then the second time I say it, I say la maison. You should always repeat la maison. By saying la maison, you learn that the word is a feminine word. Okay? And then appartement. You'll hear l'appartement. Unfortunately, because it starts with a vowel sound, and we say it's L apostrophe is the way it's spelled, but the idea is it's the way to say the before a vowel sound. You won't know if it's a masculine or feminine word. It'll only be through exposure to appartement in other situations, in other contexts. But you'll pick up on whether it's un appartement or une appartement, and it's un appartement. It's a masculine word. Okay, so the reason we make this choice between un and une is because we know whether the word is masculine or feminine. And if we don't, maybe at first you'll make a mistake. You'll say un appartement, but you won't make the mistake too many times because people look at you kind of strange when you say un appartement. And through exposure, through repetition, you'll not make the mistake again. Okay, so it's up to you now to get into lesson 1.21 to practice these questions. You should be practicing both forms so that you can change it up once in a while and use a little variety in your speech as you speak with your language pal, with your correspondent. And then enter into 1.22 using those pictures there. You will hopefully engage with an overseas correspondent, maybe somebody locally who's a native speaker of French, and at the very least with your classroom teacher if you have one. But really seek to establish a relationship. Encourage your teacher to enable you to enter in a relationship through some online service that hooks up classrooms around the world to enter in a relationship with a native speaker of French who similarly wants to learn your language, and you'll be helping them learn your language as well. Okay, I'll see you in the course of lesson 1.23. Au revoir.